Welcome to today's discussion on feminist literary criticism. Dr. Jasvant Rathod joins us to explore Betty Friedan's seminal work, The Feminine Mystique. Dr. Rathod, how did Friedan's book articulate the widespread dissatisfaction among American women in the 1960s?
Thank you for having me. Friedan coined the problem that has no name to capture the unspoken unhappiness of women confined to domestic roles. Her analysis revealed that many women felt trapped in their roles as housewives, unable to voice their discontent, a sentiment that resonated with millions.
Indeed, The Feminine Mystique sold millions of copies and struck a chord. But was this dissatisfaction unique to middle-class women, or did it reflect broader systemic issues?
That's a crucial question. While Friedan focused on middle-class suburban women, she highlighted systemic oppression that affected all women. A 1963 survey revealed that a staggering 60% of women felt isolated in their struggles, suggesting a widespread issue rather than isolated cases.
However, some critics argue that Friedan's focus was too narrow, excluding working-class women and women of color. How do you respond to this?
Critics like bell hooks certainly raise valid points about intersectionality. Friedan's work primarily addressed a specific demographic, but it laid the groundwork for later feminist movements to expand the conversation to include diverse experiences and systemic inequalities.
Moving to Friedan's challenge of gender stereotypes, how did The Feminine Mystique confront the idealized image of femininity in popular culture?
Friedan dissected the feminine mystique, which glorified domesticity and discouraged women from seeking education or careers. She critiqued media and advertising for perpetuating these stereotypes, arguing they stifled women's potential. It was a groundbreaking challenge to cultural norms.
This critique of domesticity was revolutionary, but didn't it also face pushback for undermining traditional family values?
Absolutely, some perceived it as an attack on the family structure. However, Friedan argued that true fulfillment for women comes from pursuing personal interests and careers outside the home. This idea was radical at the time but has since become a cornerstone of feminist ideology.
What real-world changes did Friedan's critiques inspire in terms of policy or societal norms?
Her work catalyzed the formation of feminist organizations like the National Organization for Women, which pushed for equal pay, workplace rights, and educational opportunities. These efforts gradually shifted societal expectations of women's roles, echoing Friedan's call for autonomy.
Let's delve into Friedan's critique of Freudian theory. How did she challenge these psychoanalytic frameworks?
Friedan argued that Freudian theories provided a pseudoscientific basis for sexist views, justifying women's subordination. She criticized Freud's notions of female inferiority and argued that they reinforced gender inequality, limiting women's roles to domestic spheres.
Some might say Freud's theories were a product of their time. How do modern feminists view his influence on gender roles?
Many modern feminists still critique Freudian theory for its patriarchal underpinnings. However, they also recognize the historical context and use Friedan's critiques as a basis for reevaluating psychological theories to ensure they support gender equality.
Could Friedan's analysis of Freudian theory be seen as a precursor to more nuanced feminist psychological critique today?
Certainly, Friedan opened the door for feminist psychologists to further analyze and question psychological theories, leading to more inclusive and equitable frameworks that consider intersectional identities and experiences. Friedan's legacy lies in her transformation of personal struggles into public activism. Her articulation of systemic gender oppression remains relevant as feminists today continue to challenge societal constructs that limit women's potential across various spheres. The next frontier involves tackling digital gender divides, advocating for reproductive rights in restrictive environments, and continuing to challenge systemic inequalities in education and employment. Friedan's emphasis on questioning norms provides a timeless framework for these efforts.
The second sex is pivotal in feminist philosophy. Dr. Rathod, can you explain her concept of otherness and its impact on feminist literary criticism?
Certainly, Beauvoir's otherness posits that women are constructed as the other compared to men who are viewed as the norm. This idea is crucial as it highlights how patriarchal societies perpetuate women's marginalization, not only in literature but in broader cultural narratives.
That's fascinating. Could you give an example of how this concept manifested in historical texts?
Beauvoir critiqued philosophers like Aristotle who called women imperfect men. This notion infiltrated cultural stories shaping centuries of literature. For instance, in many classical texts, women are depicted as secondary to male protagonists.
Critics might argue that such portrayals are a product of their time. How would you counter this argument?
While historical context is important, Beauvoir's analysis urges us to question why these ideas persist. The enduring nature of these portrayals suggests systemic biases, not mere historical artifacts, thus needing contemporary scrutiny.
Looking forward, how do Beauvoir's ideas influence modern feminist criticism?
Her work inspires ongoing analysis of gender in literature, encouraging critics to challenge entrenched norms and recover marginalized voices. This shift is evident in today's intersectional feminist critiques.
Another key idea from Beauvoir is that one is not born, but becomes a woman. How did this redefine gender roles in feminist criticism?
Beauvoir distinguished between biological sex and socially constructed gender. She argued that femininity is not innate but shaped by societal expectations. This was revolutionary, challenging essentialist views and prompting critics to explore how literature perpetuates gender stereotypes.
Given this perspective, what impact did it have on feminist literary analysis?
It shifted the focus to how texts reinforce or resist these constructed roles. For example, critics began examining characters not just as individuals but as embodiments of societal norms, revealing deeper insights into gender dynamics.
There are those who believe gender roles are biologically determined. How does Beauvoir's argument stand against this view?
Beauvoir's argument remains robust as it emphasizes the role of culture and environment in shaping identity. While biology contributes to gender, her work shows that societal structures heavily influence how gender is expressed.
In what ways do you see her ideas evolving in future feminist literary discourse?
Future discussions will likely delve deeper into intersectionality, examining how gender intersects with race, class, and other identities. Beauvoir's framework provides a solid foundation for these complex analyses.
Beauvoir also critiqued patriarchal myths in literature. Dr. Rathod, how did she address these myths, and what examples illustrate her critique?
Beauvoir analyzed works by authors like Balzac and D.H. Lawrence, highlighting how they portrayed women as passive or secondary to men's stories. Her critique exposed how such narratives limit women's autonomy and reinforce patriarchal ideologies.
Could you share an anecdote or specific example of how Beauvoir's critique is applied in literary studies?
In critiquing Henry Miller, she noted how his female characters often serve as mere backdrops to male experiences. This analysis encourages critics to question similar dynamics in contemporary literature.
Some may argue that these myths are literary devices rather than ideological statements. What would you say to that?
While literary devices, they mirror societal values. Beauvoir's critique reveals how these narratives sustain gender biases, prompting us to reconsider the impact of storytelling on cultural perceptions.
How do you see her work influencing future examinations of literature?
Her insights inspire a critical lens on modern media, encouraging not just critique but the creation of diverse narratives that challenge traditional gender roles.
Finally, let's discuss Beauvoir's existentialist feminism. How did she integrate existentialism into feminist thought, and why is it still relevant today?
Beauvoir applied existentialist ideas, arguing that women must assert their freedom and agency, transcending societal limitations. This notion of transcendence over immanence remains vital as it empowers individuals to define their identities beyond imposed constraints.
Can you provide an example of how existentialist feminism is applied in current feminist discourse?
Contemporary feminists use this framework to explore themes of autonomy and choice in women's writing. For instance, analyzing protagonists who break free from traditional roles to forge independent paths.
Critics might say existentialism is too abstract for practical application. How would you address this concern? Looking ahead, how do you foresee Beauvoir's existentialist ideas evolving within feminist theory?
Her ideas will likely intersect more with digital identities and virtual spaces, exploring how technology influences gender and identity, continuing to inspire new ways of thinking about
Elaine
freedom and
Showalter
self-determination.
revolutionized feminist literary criticism with her concept of gynecriticism. Dr. Rathod, can you explain what distinguishes gynecriticism from earlier feminist critiques?
Certainly, gynecriticism, introduced by Showalter in 1979, focuses on women as creators rather than subjects of male-authored texts. For example, in her work, A Literature of Their Own, she traces the evolution of women's literature through distinct phases.
That's intriguing. But doesn't focusing solely on women risk creating an echo chamber of sorts, possibly excluding male perspectives that can enrich feminist discourse?
It's a valid concern. However, Showalter argues that understanding women's unique literary contributions requires a separate framework. She does not advocate for isolating women's literature but rather emphasizes analyzing it within cultural contexts.
This approach seems to have paved the way for more inclusive studies. How do you see gynecriticism influencing future literary criticism? Showalter identified 3 phases in women's literature: feminine, feminist, and female. Initially, women imitated male writing styles, as seen in the work of early novelists like the Bronte sisters.
So the feminist phase involved protest against male dominance. Can you give an example of how this manifested in literature?
Certainly, during this phase, writers like Virginia Woolf openly challenged patriarchal norms. However, some critics argue that this focus on protest might overshadow women's unique narratives.
That's an interesting critique. Moving to the female phase, how did women's writing evolve to explore autonomy?
By the female phase, women began to explore themes of identity and autonomy beyond mere protest. Toni Morrison, for example, delves into complex identity issues in works like Beloved, offering a nuanced view of female experiences. Showalter proposed 4 models of feminist criticism: biological, linguistic, psychoanalytic, and cultural. How do these models enrich our understanding of women's literature?
These models provide a multifaceted view of literature. For instance, the biological model explores how women's bodily experiences influence creativity, akin to how pregnancy is metaphorically linked to creation.
However, isn't there a risk of essentialism here, assuming all women write based on shared biological experiences?
Indeed, essentialism is a critique of gynecriticism. Showalter acknowledges this but argues that these models simply offer one lens. The cultural model, for instance, highlights diversity among women, considering race and class.
How do these models guide future research in feminist literary criticism? Cultural feminism, as emphasized by Showalter, examines women's literature within broader social contexts. It recognizes literature as a collective cultural experience, not isolated from male traditions.
That seems to promote a more holistic understanding. But does this risk diluting the focus on women's unique contributions by integrating male perspectives?
A fair point. However, Showalter believes that understanding women's roles within a larger framework enriches feminist discourse. For example, analyzing Jane Eyre's Bertha Mason reveals layers of suppressed rage contextualized within societal norms.
It seems cultural feminism could significantly influence future discourse. How do you envision its role in shaping upcoming literary studies?
I foresee a continued emphasis on intersectionality, where future studies incorporate diverse voices, acknowledging the multiplicity of women's experiences across today's episode, where we delve into second-wave feminism, which emerged in the 1960s and continued through the 1980s. Dr. Jasvant Rathod is here to discuss its expansion beyond first-wave achievements. Dr. Rathod, could you start by explaining the broader scope of this movement?
Certainly, while the first wave focused on legal rights like suffrage, the second wave tackled issues such as workplace discrimination and reproductive rights. It was a response to women realizing that legal equality wasn't enough without addressing societal and cultural inequalities.
That's a significant shift. However, were there any criticisms about the movement's scope? We've seen critiques about its focus primarily on issues affecting white middle-class women.
That's a valid point. The movement's early focus often sidelined the experiences of women of color and working-class women. This oversight was later addressed by intersectional feminists who highlighted the multifaceted nature of women's oppression.
Looking ahead, how did this movement lay the groundwork for future feminist waves? Let's move on to the landmark achievements of second-wave feminism. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Roe v. Wade in 1973 were pivotal. Dr. Rathod, could you elaborate on these victories? While these were significant, some argue legal victories didn't translate to immediate societal change. How would you respond to that?
There's truth in that. Legal changes often precede societal shifts. The groundwork laid by these legal victories did spark essential conversations and actions that slowly transformed societal norms.
In your view, what future legal reforms could continue this transformation? An intriguing aspect of second-wave feminism was the consciousness-raising groups. Dr. Rathod, how did these grassroots efforts contribute to the movement? However, the movement wasn't monolithic. What were some of the diverse feminist perspectives that emerged?
Liberal feminism advocated for legislative reforms, while radical feminism aimed to dismantle patriarchal structures. Intersectional feminism highlighted how race, class, and sexuality intersect with gender oppression.
Could these diverse ideologies sometimes clash? Let's turn to feminist literary criticism, a crucial aspect of second-wave feminism. Dr. Rathod, how did this critique transform literature?
Feminist critics examined literature to uncover patriarchal narratives, advocating for the inclusion of women's voices. They rediscovered authors like Mary Shelley, whose works were re-evaluated for their contributions to literature.
Yet, some argue that focusing on gender in literature overlooks other critical dimensions. How do you address this critique?
It's likely to become more inclusive, embracing digital platforms and diverse voices. The emphasis will be on global perspectives, reflecting the interconnected nature of
Today, we dive into the
today's world.
revolutionary concept of écriture féminine, as developed by Helene Sixus. Dr. Rathod, how did Sixus' ideas disrupt traditional literary norms?
Sixus fundamentally challenged the patriarchal logic embedded in literature. Her 1975 essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, proposed a distinctly feminine writing style, characterized by fluidity and multiplicity. This was a stark departure from male-centered narratives that dominated literary theory.
Can you give us an anecdote that illustrates this disruption?
Certainly, imagine the traditional hero's journey, which is linear and goal-oriented. Sixus would argue for a narrative like a river, flowing in multiple directions and exploring various paths. It's like comparing a highway to a winding stream.
But some critics argue that such fluidity can lead to incoherence. How does Sixus' approach address this potential pitfall?
That's a valid concern. Sixus counters this by emphasizing the richness of women's experiences, which inherently embrace complexity. Her writing fosters a new coherence based on the interconnectedness of ideas, akin to how ecosystems thrive on diversity.
Moving forward, let's discuss Sixus' critique of phallocentric discourse. How does she propose we move beyond these limitations?
Sixus critiques the dominance of phallocentrism, which prioritizes male perspectives. She advocates for writing that represents the female body and desire, thereby embracing fluidity and multiple narratives.
Some might argue that this approach lacks the structure necessary for effective storytelling. How does she respond to such critiques?
Sixus believes that structure shouldn't constrain but rather facilitate expression. She uses poetic language and fragmentation to reflect the complexities of female identity, akin to how jazz uses improvisation to create beauty.
What future developments do you foresee in addressing these phallocentric narratives?
We're seeing an increasing push towards inclusive narratives that draw from diverse cultural and gender perspectives, fostering a global literary tapestry that resonates with varied human experiences.
Let's explore how Sixus blends theoretical and creative writing. How does this fusion manifest in her work?
Sixus' work is a dance between theory and creativity. She uses poetic and ecstatic language to subvert traditional literary forms as seen in her essays and fictional narratives.
Critics might argue that such blending dilutes the rigor of academic discourse. What would Sixus say to that?
Sixus would argue that the fusion enriches discourse. By employing wordplay and fragmentation, she opens up new avenues for understanding complex themes, similar to how abstract art evokes emotion beyond literal interpretation.
In what ways do you think this approach will influence future literary theories?
As interdisciplinary studies gain traction, Sixus' approach could inspire new methods of integrating narrative with philosophical and cultural analysis, broadening the scope of literary criticism.
Finally, let's discuss Sixus' impact on feminist theory. How have her ideas shaped contemporary discourse?
Sixus has profoundly influenced feminist literary criticism by encouraging women to write themselves into literature, challenging essentialist notions of gender, and exploring the relationship between language, body, and identity.
However, some argue that her theories are too abstract to be widely applicable. How do you address this critique?
I foresee a continuous evolution towards more inclusive and intersectional analyses, drawing from Sixus' principles to challenge and expand existing frameworks, thereby enriching our understanding of gender in literature.
Contributions to feminist literary criticism are profound. Dr. Rathod, could you elaborate on the significance of her work, A Room of One's Own?
A Room of One's Own is a seminal text where Woolf argues that women need financial independence and personal space to be creative. This idea is encapsulated in her famous quote about needing money and a room to write fiction, a concept underscoring how societal and economic barriers stifled women's creative potential.
That's indeed thought-provoking. However, some critics argue that Woolf's focus on economic independence was too idealistic for her era. What do you think about this criticism?
While it's true Woolf's ideas seemed ambitious, they sparked crucial conversations about gender and economics. Historical context shows that lack of education and property rights significantly limited women's opportunities, serving as a stark reminder of the challenges they faced.
Looking forward, how do Woolf's ideas influence current feminist discourse, especially regarding economic empowerment?
Her work continues to inspire movements advocating for equal pay and gender equality in professional spaces, pushing for a world where women can truly have both the figurative and literal room to express their creativity.
In her writings, Woolf imagined a fictional sister of Shakespeare named Judith. Can you explain the relevance of this metaphor in feminist criticism?
Absolutely. Judith Shakespeare represents the countless talented women whose genius went unrecognized due to lack of access to education and societal constraints. Woolf used this powerful metaphor to highlight the systemic exclusion of women from the literary canon.
Some might argue that this is just hypothetical. How does this metaphor hold up against historical evidence? How does this metaphor speak to today's efforts to diversify literary voices?
It underscores the importance of recognizing and amplifying underrepresented voices across all cultures, pushing for diverse narratives to be included in mainstream literature.
Woolf celebrated female authors like Austen and the Brontes. How did this reclamation contribute to feminist literary criticism, Dr. Rathod?
Woolf's recognition of these writers was pivotal in valuing women's literary contributions. By celebrating their work, she challenged the male-dominated literary tradition and paved the way for a more inclusive understanding of literature.
Critics, however, argue that focusing on a few prominent women neglects lesser-known authors. What's your take on that?
Her work encourages ongoing rediscovery and celebration of women's literature, prompting future scholars to unearth and cherish hidden literary gems from various cultures and eras.
Woolf critiqued patriarchal language and used innovative styles like stream of consciousness. How did these stylistic choices reflect her feminist beliefs?
Woolf's use of stream of consciousness broke traditional narrative forms, creating space for authentic female voices. By challenging patriarchal language, she sought to redefine how women's experiences were expressed in literature.
Some argue that her narrative style is too complex for broad audiences. Does this complexity limit its accessibility?
While complex, Woolf's style invites readers to engage deeply with the text, offering a richer understanding of characters' inner lives. It's a trade-off that ultimately enriches literary discourse. Her innovations inspire writers to experiment with narrative forms, encouraging diverse storytelling methods that reflect varied human experiences and promote greater
Dr. Rathod,
inclusivity in
Mary
literature.
Wollstonecraft is often celebrated for her contributions to feminist literary criticism. Can you elaborate on how she used her writings to challenge patriarchal norms?
Certainly, Wollstonecraft's work, particularly A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, boldly critiqued the entrenched patriarchal ideologies of her time. For instance, she dissected John Milton's Paradise Lost, arguing that his depiction of Eve reinforced female submission to male authority. Her critiques were not just literary but extended to philosophical underpinnings.
It's fascinating how she tackled such formidable figures. How did her approach differ from other thinkers of her era, especially those who upheld these patriarchal views?
Wollstonecraft was unique in combining philosophical rigor with accessible literary critique. Unlike Rousseau, who in Emile advocated for women's education merely to please men, Wollstonecraft envisioned a society where women were rational beings deserving equal educational opportunities. Her revolutionary stance challenged the very core of Enlightenment ideals, which often excluded women.
She seemed ahead of her time in this regard. Given her radical views, were there any significant counterarguments or criticisms she faced?
Indeed, many contemporaries dismissed her ideas as too radical, arguing that they threatened social stability. Wollstonecraft countered by showing how systemic oppression, not gender equality, destabilized society. Her arguments laid the foundation for future feminist critiques, highlighting the importance of education and intellectual development for women.
Wollstonecraft's literary critiques extend beyond Milton. How did she address other influential texts of her time?
She was relentless in her critique of works like Rousseau's Emile and John Gregory's A Legacy to His Daughters. Wollstonecraft exposed how these texts perpetuated restrictive gender norms, often under the guise of moral guidance. By challenging these narratives, she revealed the systemic nature of gender oppression.
It's intriguing how she identified a male literary tradition. How did she propose to counteract this tradition?
Wollstonecraft advocated for a reimagining of literary and philosophical traditions to include women's perspectives. She emphasized the need for women's voices in intellectual discourse, much like the Bluestocking movement, which promoted female intellectual engagement. Her work inspired later feminist literary critics to scrutinize how literature reflects societal power structures.
In addressing these literary traditions, did she suggest any methods to ensure diversity and inclusion in literature?
Yes, she called for a broader representation of voices in literature and education, urging society to embrace a universal human identity beyond gender constructs. This forward-looking insight anticipated modern discussions on diversity in literature and the role of education in dismantling biases.
Dr. Rathod, Wollstonecraft's advocacy for women's education was groundbreaking. Can you explain her rationale and its impact?
Wollstonecraft argued that women's perceived inferiority was not innate but a result of their lack of educational opportunities. She believed that if given the same educational resources as men, women could contribute equally to society. This was a radical departure from the prevailing belief that women's roles were confined to domesticity.
Her ideas must have faced significant opposition. How did she address the counterarguments against women's education?
Opponents claimed that educating women would disrupt social order. Wollstonecraft countered by asserting that an educated populace, irrespective of gender, was essential for societal progress. Her emphasis on rational discourse and emotional appeal made her arguments persuasive and impactful.
Did she propose any specific educational models or methods that could facilitate this change?
Wollstonecraft advocated for coeducational systems where boys and girls learn together. She argued for curricula that fostered critical thinking and creativity, aiming to cultivate rational, independent individuals. This approach envisioned a future where gender did not dictate one's intellectual or societal potential.
Wollstonecraft's critique of gendered language was quite advanced for her time. How did she address this issue in her works?
In A Vindication of the Rights of Man, she critiqued Edmund Burke's gendered language which associated femininity with weakness. Wollstonecraft argued for a universal human identity, challenging the binary definitions of strength and weakness. She believed that language shaped societal perceptions and needed to evolve beyond gendered constructs.
It's remarkable how she anticipated modern discussions on language and gender. Were there counterarguments to her views on language?
Yes, many argued that traditional language was deeply ingrained and necessary for social cohesion. Wollstonecraft, however, demonstrated that such language perpetuated inequality. She urged for linguistic reform to reflect a more egalitarian society, an insight that continues to resonate in contemporary debates on inclusive language.
Looking forward, how might her perspectives influence future feminist theories on language and identity?
Her work paves the way for ongoing discussions about the power of language in shaping identity and societal norms. As we continue to challenge and redefine gender roles, Wollstonecraft's insights serve as a crucial foundation for understanding the intersection of language,
Welcome to
identity,
today's episode,
and equality.
where we dive into the origins of feminist literary criticism. Dr. Rathod, can you explain how early feminism influenced this field?
Certainly, feminist literary criticism has its roots in the first wave of feminism, which was pivotal in critiquing literature for its portrayal of women. Notably, works like Mary Ellman's Thinking About Women questioned patriarchal biases.
And how did this critique manifest in literature analysis? Could you give us an example?
Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, for instance, was analyzed for its depiction of gender roles. Critics argued that such texts reinforced societal norms that marginalized women.
Some argue these analyses were too narrow, focusing only on Western literature. How do you respond to this critique?
That's a valid point. Early criticism often lacked diversity, but it set the stage for more inclusive approaches. As feminist thought evolved, it began incorporating voices from various cultural backgrounds.
Let's delve deeper into the first wave of feminism. Dr. Rathod, how did it begin and what were its main goals?
The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 is a key starting point. Led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it marked the formal beginning of organized feminist activism, focusing on legal and political equality.
Securing the right to vote was crucial. How did this movement achieve such a significant milestone?
Through persistent activism. For instance, the 19th Amendment in the U.S. and the Equal Franchise Act in Britain were results of relentless efforts by suffragists who lobbied, protested, and campaigned tirelessly.
Critics argue that the movement was exclusionary, often sidelining non-white and working-class women. What's your take?
Indeed, the first wave predominantly involved middle-class white women, creating early tensions regarding race and class. However, activists like Ida B. Wells Barnett fought for inclusivity, blending suffrage with civil rights.
In what ways did the first wave of feminism impact literature and broader society?
It was transformative. Literature began to reflect women's struggles for equality, and society saw legal victories like voting rights and property reforms, changing the perception of women's roles.
Can you share an anecdotal example of this change in literature?
Certainly, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics dissected male authors' works, revealing underlying misogyny. This kind of critique encouraged authors to portray women more realistically and sympathetically.
Some argue that the first wave's focus was too narrow, mainly legal reforms. What about the broader social aspects?
While legal equality was a focus, it laid the groundwork for future waves that tackled deeper societal issues like workplace rights and reproductive freedoms, emphasizing a more intersectional approach.
As we wrap up, let's discuss the legacy of the first wave and its impact on feminist literary criticism today. Dr. Rathod, how has it evolved?
The first wave provided a critical lens for examining literature highlighting gender biases. This has evolved into a more nuanced analysis, incorporating intersectionality and diverse perspectives.
How do modern movements differ from the first wave in their approach to literature?
Today's feminist criticism explores themes beyond gender, including race, class, and sexuality. It's about understanding how these intersecting identities influence both writers and readers.
Looking forward, what do you see as the next step for feminist literary criticism?
I foresee a continued expansion into global narratives challenging Eurocentric views. Future criticism will likely embrace digital platforms, reaching broader audiences and encouraging inclusive dialogues.